Dave Talks Comics, episode 102. Dave Talks Comics in 2015, part 1. On this episode, the first of a two-part look back at this podcast in 2015. Normally, I would have done this in a single episode, but as I started to record, I realized that it had a lot more material than I like to usually include in a single episode. I'm still a little hung up on the idea of keeping this podcast from getting too long. And so that led me to break this into two parts. On this first part, I'll be doing a quick rundown of the comic books and cartoons that I talked about on the podcast in 2015. And then I'll start to go through some of the movies, cartoons, and TV shows that I watched in 2015, but I did not get around to talking about. I want to begin this retrospective look at 2015 by going over quick look at the comic books that I talked about on this program. I've organized them by the decade that they were published. Similar to last year, similar to 2014, in 2015, I only had one episode that was dedicated to comic books from the 1960s, and that was episode 99, which was on Iron Man Tales of Suspense. The 70s didn't do much better. I only had 3 episodes that were dedicated to comic books from the 70s, and those were, 5 episodes, but only 3 subjects. I did 2 episodes on the Micronauts, which were parts 2 and 3 of my coverage of the first 12 issues of the Micronauts comic book from the 1970s. And actually, that last issue was from December of 79, so it just barely made it in under the something, whatever it would be. Issue 71 was on Power Girl, and in that episode, I talked about Showcase 97 to 99, which was the first solo Power Girl story. On episode 75 and 76, I talked about Tarzan by Joe Kubert, which was originally published by DC, but the reprint that I read was released by Dark Horse, because I guess they had acquired the license to Tarzan at that point, at least for comic book purposes. The 1980s get the biggest. I spent more time on comic books from the 1980s than I did on any other decade. So, for starters, and I'm doing these in the order of the episodes, not in chronological order of the comic books. Episode 63 was on Daredevil Born Again. I really enjoyed doing that episode. I think that's one of the... I think I've done a lot of good ones this past year, but that's definitely up there among them. Episode 64 was the last episode I did on Who's Ohatmu. That was 2.2. And I have yet to do another Who's Ohatmu, where I would talk about Who's Who, the definitive director of the DC Universe, and the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. I was kind of going through the entries and talking about the characters, doing a little bit of research, remembering stories that I had read, and I've just completely gotten away from it. Honestly, I think it was a little too big of a task to take on. I mean, at the pace I was going, it was taking forever. I think I'd done 7 or 8 episodes altogether of this series, and I was still only into issue 2 of each of these comic book series. And one series was 15 issues, the other one was 26 issues. It was going to take forever to get through all them. I don't know if I'll ever get back to it. I'm certainly not going to promise to get back to it at this point. But both of those series came out during the 1980s. And there have been updates, other updates to them during the 80s and since the 80s. But episode 66 was on Uncanny X-Men 148 to 150. Episode 67 was on Batman, A Death in the Family. Episode 71, more Power Girl, this time from the 1980s. There was a focus on Secret Origins number 11, which was the post-crisis origin of Power Girl. Episode 82 was on the New Teen Titans, Batman and the Outsiders crossover, which started in New Teen Titans number 37 and concluded in Batman and the Outsiders number 5. Episodes 84 and 94 were on All-Star Squadron. I covered issues 27 and 28 in the first one, and 27 and 28 in the first one, and 29 and 30 in the second one. And for the most part, those were, well, 3 of those issues were on the Justice Society stories, and one of them was a secret, 7 Soldiers of Victory story. Episode 85 was on Superman Annual 11 for The Man Who Has Everything. On episode 86, I talked about Alpha Flight issues 13 through 16. On episodes 88, 95, and 101, I started to talk about the Legion of Superheroes, the Great Darkness Saga. So these 3 episodes were the first 3 parts of my coverage. And this is a series that I'm going to continue with. And I hope to finish up at some point in the next few months. I'm probably not going to be doing more than 1 episode a month on this, but I expect there's going to be 3 more episodes in this series. It's a total of 15 issues, which includes 2 double-sized issues, and I've got 6 more issues to go. I've covered 8 so far. So, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 2 episodes, or 2 issues per episode for the remainder of the story. On episode 100, I talked about Marvel 2-in-1 number 100. Also on episode 75, I talked about the 75-cent era at DC and Marvel. And on episode 100, I also talked about dollar comics. Both of those stretched a little beyond the boundaries of the 1980s, but I think for the most part, the books that were 75 cents and the books that were $1 came out during the 1980s, for the most part. In the 1990s, not too much here. I read another story from Batman Legends of the Dark Knight. This time it was, the story was called Blades, and it was from issues 32 to 34. It was written by James Robinson and drawn by Tim Sale, and that was on episode 67. I talked about that. On episode 98, I talked about Superman Adventures, several issues of Superman Adventures, all of which I believe I picked up at the Baltimore Comic-Con in 2015. I actually talked about more comic books from the 2000s than I did the 1990s. Let's see, on episode 62, I talked about Hard Time, the issue 7 through 12, which was the last 6 issues of the original run of Hard Time. On episode 71, more Power Girl. This time I read JSA Classified issues 1 through 4. On episodes 75 and 76, I talked about the Samurai Jack comic book from IDW, which came out just in the last couple years, I believe. So 2014, I think, was when it started to come out. Also on episode 75, I talked about Volume 3 of Exterminators. That was a Vertigo series about an extermination company. In other words, a company that is responsible for removing insects and rats and things like that. Probably not the right thing. Not everybody's cup of tea, but kind of gross at points. On episode 81, I talked about Parker the Hunter by Darwin Cook. Now, this is an adaptation of a novel by, I believe, Donald Westlake was the name of the author. I haven't read any of his books, but I read this. I'd actually bought it a few years before, and I tried to read it, and for some reason I stopped reading it, and then this year, or in 2015, I got back to it and read the whole thing, and enjoyed it quite a bit. It was a little slow at the beginning. On episode 86, I talked about Empire, Volume 1 by Mark Waid and Barry Kitson. This is a series that it was originally published by DC Comics, but then later Mark Waid and Barry Kitson own it, and they moved it to Thrillbent, and you can get it through there. And there was a trade paperback of the series from DC at one point. I don't know who's publishing that original run, but they have continued the story in Volume 2, which I think picks up a couple years later. Okay, so the breakdown of the cartoons. I talked about Justice League Unlimited on episodes 65, 70, 83, 85, and 87. And there was episodes from both season 1 and season 2 in there. For the most part, the focus was on the Cadmus storyline. There were probably a couple other stories that showed up, though. And I finished off that run on the Cadmus story, and I'm planning to, and I've probably talked about this before, but I'm planning to do some episodes on Season 3 of Justice League Unlimited. It's just a matter of deciding when to do that. I did one episode on Superman the Animated Series, and actually it was an episode that was also, I did some talk on Justice League Unlimited, and that was episode 87. And I talked about 2 episodes from Season 2 of Superman the Animated Series. There was one episode in 2015 where I talked about Young Justice, and that was episode 76. And basically I talked about the end of the first season and how my feelings about the end of the season. I talked a little bit about how it ended and a little bit about what I thought of how it ended. There was also on episode 76, I talked a little bit about 2 TV shows, not cartoons, but I guess live action TV shows that I watched in this past year, and those are Arrow and Daredevil. It was not a recap of the seasons. It was just what I was watching at the time, just before I recorded those episodes. Knights of Sidonia was my primary focus for the anime episodes. There was 3 anime-focused episodes. 2 of them were on Knights of Sidonia, both on Season 1. And I went into a lot of detail on this because that show, as I talked about in that episode, everything is flying at you so fast. And I really took some time and went through those episodes in a very detailed way with a lot of pausing. And I made a lot of notes as to what was going on. And I talked a lot about that, just partly so I could gain an understanding of exactly what was happening and to put it all down in a concise form so I can go back and listen to it before I start watching Season 2. And then, and the other episode where I talked about anime was episode 68, where I talked about 2 series that I was watching at the time, neither of which I finished entirely. One is Space Pirate Captain Harlock, which was a anime show from the 1970s, I believe 1978, which ran about 42 episodes, I think. I think I made it through about 12 or 13 episodes before I stopped watching. I think something was eating at my time, and I just didn't have the time to watch it, but I have yet to get back to it. The other show was Sword Art Online, which is from just a few years ago. And I did watch all of Season 1, but I have yet to get into Season 2. I went to 4 comic book conventions in 2015. The first one was the Appleseed Comic-Con, which was in May in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And this was my second year going. And I talked about that on episodes 72, 73, and 74. Unfortunately, there's not going to be an Appleseed Comic-Con next year, so or in 2016. So I'm definitely not going to it again this year. In June, I went to Heroes Con, which is in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I put together 5 episodes on that. And those are episodes 77, 78, 79, 80, and 81. And in both the Appleseed Comic-Con shows and the Heroes Con shows, because those are so far, because I have to drive so far, and I choose to drive to get to these shows, you don't just get my reactions to the show, but also a little bit about my drives to the show and from the show. In September, I went to first the Small Press Expo, which is in North Bethesda, Maryland, and I talked about that on episode 89. And then the next weekend, I went to the Baltimore Comic-Con, which is, of course, in Baltimore, Maryland, and I talked about that on episodes 90, 91, and 92. I didn't talk about any movies that I saw this year, but I did see a few comic book related movies. The first 3 are all from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I think that's what they call it, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I saw Thor: The Dark World. Which I liked very much, and I think a big part of that is Tom Hiddleston, who plays Loki, and he is, hands down, as far as I'm concerned, the best actor in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The next one I saw was Captain America: The Winter Soldier, which I liked up to a point, and I didn't think it was great. I really didn't care for the way it ended, like the last half hour or so. I thought that the movie got to be much too much about big machines crashing into each other and blowing things up, and it looked very chaotic. And up to that point, it had been kind of interesting. It had been kind of a thriller, and Cap and the Black Widow trying to figure out what's going on, and the Falcon, I guess, trying to figure out what's going on and dig into these things. But then in the end, it just devolved into this huge, it reminds me of like watching a video game, is what it is, which reminds me of, say, like the third Matrix film, which, like, almost an hour of that, it seemed to me, was just like one big watching a video game. You're just watching all these machines fight each other, and there's no acting, or very little acting, and for the most part, it's just computer animation. And it felt like that with the Winter Soldier, Captain America: The Winter Soldier. And the third one I saw was Guardians of the Galaxy, which I've got to say I really didn't care for that much. It really didn't do much for me. There was nothing there to hook me in. I didn't really like it. It felt in some ways like the Avengers movie, but with the Avengers movie it was different. And I mean the first Avengers film, because with the first Avengers film we had gotten to see all of the main characters in other movies, and so they were already established. And here it felt similar to that, except for these characters hadn't been established. And I don't know, it didn't really work for me. It went too fast. It felt like they were trying to do too much and put too much into the film. And so I had probably elevated expectations based on what other people had said about the movie. So a few other movies that I saw that kind of have some sort of relationship to comic books, maybe, or cartoons. I saw Birdman, which is that Michael Keaton film, which I believe came out in late 2014, which was about an aging actor who is trying to revitalize his career, who had played a comic book character in movies, and is now doing a stage play with the hopes of being taken more seriously. And probably the most interesting thing about the movie, I think Michael Keaton's very good in it. And of course he played Batman in 2 films, yes, just 2 films, in the late 80s, early 90s. And both of which, well, one of which I think is great, the other which is interesting. But it was an interesting film, but the most interesting thing about it was probably the way they shot it to make it look like it was all shot as one take, one continuous take, and which was a little... I actually watched it twice, or I watched the first hour twice, because I watched it, and I got to a point where it was very tiring to watch it because there was no real break. The action just kept going and going and going. And when I say action, I don't mean, like there was fights or explosions or things like that. I just mean that the story just kept going and going. The scene would shift. It was like the camera was continuously moving. And there's obviously little points in there where they could have broken from one scene and gone to another, but it looked like it was all filmed like one continuous film, kind of like a play is, except for they were moving around quite a bit, much more than they could do on a stage. And so it was an interesting film, but I don't know if I loved it. So, well, I know that what I didn't love was Masters of the Universe, which for some reason I watched this movie. I think they were talking about it on a podcast that I was listening to. I think it was Cameron Watches Movies, but I think that's what it was. Either that or else it was the Plain Label podcast. One of those two was talking about it, and so I decided to watch Masters of the Universe. I really didn't like it. It took me several sittings to get through it. I would watch like 20 minutes and then stop, and it's not great. I mean, the guy who plays Skeletor does a great job, and there are some nice little funny bits in it, but it's really not worth looking at. I watched Ghost in the Shell, Arise, Ghost Pain. And this is the first of, I think, 3 Ghost in the Shell films. And when I first saw Ghost in the Shell and Ghost in the Shell 2, I really loved them. This was probably over 10 years ago. And I don't know what it is. I've tried going back to them, and I don't like them as much now. I'm not sure what it is or why it is, or maybe it was just the right movie at the right time for me, and now isn't the right time anymore. I'm not sure. I saw Mad Max Fury Road. I know this doesn't really have a comic book connection, or I don't think it does. But I had seen the original Mad Max films back, well, not in the theater, but not too long after they came out, and I enjoyed them, and I really enjoyed this. I thought this was a lot of fun. I thought it was a really great film, and definitely worth a see if you're into that apocalyptic car wars type of movie. And then finally, most recently I saw Star Wars: The Force Awakens, which I really enjoyed. Was it a perfect movie? No. And it obviously was taking a lot from it was modeled in a number of ways after the original Star Wars film. But so there were certain things that once I saw that, it became a little bit predictable. And it was funny because I went in with very low expectations, and they definitely exceeded those expectations. And I didn't... So I enjoyed it very much, but there was a couple funny things, like the fact that when Han Solo first showed up, I was enjoying the movie enough that I kind of felt like, why did they bring him into this? And of course, by the end of the movie, he's obviously a very important part of the film. But when he first shows up, it's like, oh, they're just bringing him in for a cameo. That's how it felt to me. But on the whole, not a perfect movie, but I think it's a lot of fun, and I think I would have liked it if I was a little kid. I certainly would have loved it, would love it, and I really like it. I think it's a great film. I think it's a lot of fun. Okay, I want to talk about some other cartoons that I didn't talk about on the program on Dave Talks Comics in the past year, that I have been watching, or that I finished watching. First up, Adventure Time, Season 3. I'm still in the middle of this. I'm probably about 2/3 of the way, maybe even 3/4 of the way through the season. I only watch this every now and then, but I always seem to enjoy it. I don't know why I don't watch it more consistently, but I still think this is a really fun show, and I like the directions it goes in, and the kinds of stories it puts together, and even the way the episodes begin and end is kind of interesting. Quite often it feels like not a traditional beginning or ending. It's not like they have to put a cap on everything and kind of have a definitive ending. It's like sometimes they just kind of stop, or they just kind of begin someplace and they don't explain everything. And I really like that. Avatar: The Last Airbender. I finished this off during 2015. I liked it. I enjoyed the show. I felt like it did a better job starting things than it did ending them. Starting and developing things than it did ending them. I wasn't crazy about the ending of the show as a whole. I mean, it's good, but it felt flawed. It felt like they didn't have enough runway to land the show properly or something like that. It felt like they had just gotten to a point where they needed more I don't know if they even knew how else they would land it. I mean, obviously they only had so much that they could do with it. They only had so much that they weren't going to be given an unlimited time frame to finish the show off. But it felt like they pushed a lot of developments right at the end of the show. And for that matter, I think that also happened at the end of season 2. But I am in the middle of watching what is either season 7 or season 9 of Futurama. Netflix calls it season 9, but when I look it up on Wikipedia, it's called season 7 of Futurama. And I'm still enjoying this show very much. I think it's a lot of fun. This is at the point where I'm past the original run of Futurama, and I'm at least 1 or 2 seasons, maybe even 3 seasons, into the second run of Futurama. I'm over 100 episodes in, I believe, at this point. I'm not sure how many more I have to go, or for that matter, how many seasons I have left. But it's still a lot of fun, and I love the irreverent tone, and it's a great show. In a similar vein, I also watched season 1 of Rick and Morty, which I thought was hilarious. It's like a adult version. Well, in a sense, it's like an adult version of Futurama in that it's irreverent, but there's cursing in it, and there's content which definitely would not be allowed on network television. I believe it's an Adult Swim show, which means it airs late at night, and it's about a kid, Morty, and his grandfather, Rick. And Morty isn't the sharpest knife in the drawer, but his grandfather is a scientist, is a brilliant inventor. And so it's kind of about their adventures. They're always taking off on these adventures. And Morty also has a sister and his parents. His grandfather is his maternal grandfather, his mother's father. And they end up going into like alternate universes, and sometimes they end up killed or changed into bugs or things like that, and it's just crazy good. It's just too funny sometimes. Sometimes I roll my eyes a little bit at it, but for the most part, it's just crazy some of the things they do on this show, and that they get away with. I guess I don't know if "get away with" is the right term, because they aren't on network television, but it's just so much fun. It was only 11 episodes the first season. I'm definitely looking for it. I hope there's going to be a second season. But that's Rick and Morty. Samurai Jack. Now, I've watched Samurai Jack in its entirety, but I decided to start watching it again. I've watched only season 1, which is the first 13 episodes, and it is a lot of fun. And I may do an episode on Samurai Jack coming up soon. We'll have to see. Or on season 1 of Samurai Jack, I should say. Star Wars Clone Wars. This is season 2. I'm still partway through season 2. I think I've held off on getting back to season 2 because I was thinking I want to do an episode about it. But now I'm thinking I should just watch it. I shouldn't hold off because I want to wait until I can see I have time in my schedule to do an episode on season 2. Because as I've said before, and I think I said this on my Dave Talks Comics in 2014 episode, is that I just don't have the time to cover everything on this show. I just don't. So, sometimes it's going to come to an end of the year or beginning of the year or year in review episode like this before I'm going to be able to talk about some of these episodes. And I don't have any notes on any particular episodes. The thing I will say about Star Wars Clone Wars is that there seems to be two kinds of episodes. The episodes with the cute aliens and the episodes that advance the story in a more serious way. And I really don't like the ones with the cute aliens. Or I find them kind of mind-numbing or, eye-rolling, or eye-roll inducing. I just don't really enjoy them. But some of the other episodes where, they have to go on these very serious missions, and they can be very interesting, very well done. Aside from cartoons, I've also watched a few other television shows that are comic book related. I watched a few episodes of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. from the first season. I watched the pilot, and then I felt like, this isn't for me. I did go. The only reason why I went back was because I heard that there was a couple episodes that were connected to the Thor film. And so I went back and I watched both of those episodes. There's one in which Peter McNichol plays a professor who, I can't remember if he's an Asgardian or he has just gotten his hands on this powerful staff, I think it is, or he's looking for the pieces of this powerful staff. And I thought that was a pretty good episode. And then I watched the other one, in which Sif appears, and I can't remember the name of the actress that plays Sif who's in both Thor films, and that was fun. I can't remember exactly what that was about. I think the Enchantress might have been in that episode also, but I'm not certain. I think she was. But that's all that I've watched. I haven't tried to go back and start from the beginning and watch it all. I've never really been crazy about the actor that plays Agent Coulson, whatever his name is. Clark Gregg, I think, is the name of the actor. But I don't know. He just doesn't do it for me. And so and for that matter, the rest of the cast doesn't impress me that much. It doesn't do anything for me. Anyway, moving on. Daredevil. I watched all of season 1 of Daredevil on Netflix. I thought it was a lot of fun. Was it perfect? No. Was it great? No. But there was enough there. I really liked Vincent D'Onofrio as the Kingpin. I thought they did a great job. The episode with Stick I thought was awesome. I can't remember if that's one of the episodes that I talked about when I talked about Daredevil on episode 76. But it was a lot of fun. I liked most of the actors on the show. I really didn't like what happened to Ben Urich at the end because I wanted that character to stay on the show. But we'll see what happens. And I'm looking forward to more on season 2. And there were some real twists at the end of that show on not the very last episode, but on the two, I think it was episodes 10 or 11 and 12. Yeah, on episodes 11 and 12, there were some real twists in there, and I don't have notes, and I can't remember exactly which episodes these things happened on, but it really got interesting at the end, and it wasn't just at the end, but they went some places I really didn't expect them to go, and it was a lot of fun to watch. And I enjoy taking my time watching these things, even though they released them all at once. I watched an episode of The Flash, and this isn't the new Flash show, but the old Flash show from 1990. And the episode I watched was the pilot. I'm kind of interested in watching more of that. I don't have it on DVD or on streaming at this point, but I think I'm going to at least buy a few individual episodes, and try watching some more of that in 2016. I tried watching Gotham. I watched the pilot, and I decided I didn't want to watch anymore. I just really didn't want to spend time on it. There's other things I would rather watch. It didn't seem that great to me. I thought they were playing just a little too fast and loose for my tastes with the characters from the comic books. It just wasn't what I wanted to see. It just, and from everything I've heard about it, it doesn't sound like, it sounds like it's going to be one of those shows where they just keep on twisting things around and keep on, with too many crazy twists to suit my tastes. I did watch, or actually I'm in the process of watching season 1 of Jessica Jones. I'm about halfway through. I am really enjoying it. In some ways, I think it might be better. I'm enjoying it at least as much as Daredevil. It might even be better than Daredevil. I don't love everything about it, but I think it's, and I don't think it's perfect or great, but it's a lot of fun. Well, I don't know, maybe fun isn't the right word, because it's definitely darker than Daredevil is. But I think it's interesting what they're doing. I wasn't so sure about seeing David Tennant play the bad guy, but I think he's great in what I've seen so far in the 6 or 7 episodes that I've watched to date. And I plan to continue watching this. I have been making notes on this. I may do an episode or 2 on Jessica Jones, season 1 of Jessica Jones. I might not. I would be remiss if I didn't say anything about season 1 of Arrow, which I finished watching this year. I don't love this show, but I continue to watch it. I sometimes feel that it's a little silly, that it's too melodramatic. I wasn't crazy about the whole love triangle between let me see, Oliver and Laurel and Tommy. That, I don't know, it was too melodramatic, like I said before. And the show on the whole isn't great, but I like the dual stories, the time on the island and the present in Starling City. And I'm just curious to see how it's going to go, where it's going to go, how it's going to unfold. I did not watch the full season. I don't binge watch, and I didn't watch this season straight through. I watched I think it's 8 episodes, and then I took a break for a couple months, and I came back and I watched another 8, and then I took a break for a few more months, then I came back and I watched the rest of it. So obviously, I'm never going to get caught up on this. I don't know. At some point, I may just drop this show. But for the present, it's okay. I'm curious to see where it goes. And I guess if there's one reason why I'm sticking around, for why I'm going to pick it up with season 2 in another month or 2 probably, it will be because I want to see the introduction of the Flash. I also want to see how things develop, if it gets any better. I know there's a lot of people out there that like this show, but I know that I don't always agree with those people. So I'm not surprised that I'm not thrilled by this show. And honestly, I don't know if they're all thrilled by the show, but I think they're probably enjoying it more than I do. That's it for episode 102 of Dave Talks Comics. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the web at davetalkscomics.com and facebook.com/DaveTalksComics. On Twitter, at DaveTalksComics. Email can be sent to davetalkscomics@gmail.com. Next time on Dave Talks Comics, part 2 of my look back at 2015. I will continue by talking about some comic books that I read but didn't talk about on the podcast, and then a higher level look at the podcast, how I produce the podcast, the website, and a bit of a look back and a look forward at how things have gone so far, how things went in 2015, and how I hope they'll go, or some of my plans for 2016. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.